The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew before opening it that my life was about to get complicated in ways I never imagined when I moved to Meadowbrook Estates in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. I'm Wesley Owens, and for the past 3 years, I've worked as a network operations supervisor for Arizona's Regional Power Grid Monitoring Center. My job requires me to be available during emergencies, natural disasters, and grid failures. When the power goes out across the valley, I'm one of the people who helps coordinate getting it back on. It's not glamorous, but it matters. The State Power Authority designated my residence as critical infrastructure 2 years ago, meaning I'm legally required to maintain backup power systems and communication equipment at my home. The letter was from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, specifically from Barbara Henderson, the HOA president, who had made it her personal mission to enforce every single rule in our community covenant with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found purpose after her kids left for college. I recognized her looping handwriting on the envelope before I even saw the return address. Inside, printed on official HOA letterhead with our neighborhood's ridiculous fountain logo, was a notice of violation and fine. My generator, according to Barbara's careful documentation, had been running for excessive and unnecessary durations over the past 6 months. She had logged dates, times, and estimated noise levels. The fine was $1,200, with an additional $200 per day if I didn't immediately cease what she called recreational generator use. I read the letter 3 times, my coffee going cold on the kitchen counter. Recreational generator use. The generator only ran during my mandatory equipment tests, which I was required by law to perform, and during actual emergencies when I needed to maintain communications with the power authority. Every single runtime was documented and necessary. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA management company, getting transferred twice before reaching someone who could actually discuss violations. The woman on the phone, Monica, sounded tired and apologetic. "Mr. Owens, I see the violation here in our system. Mrs. Henderson has been very thorough in her documentation. The HOA covenants do restrict generator usage to actual power outages only, and according to her logs, your generator has been running on multiple occasions when grid power was available in the neighborhood." "I'm on the critical infrastructure list," I explained, keeping my voice level. "The State Power Authority requires me to test my equipment monthly and maintain operational readiness. I have documentation." "I understand, but the HOA covenants were established before the Critical Infrastructure Designation Program existed. Mrs. Henderson believes the testing can be performed during actual outages." I laughed, though there was no humor in it. "That's like saying firefighters should only test their equipment during actual fires. It defeats the entire purpose." Monica sighed. "I'm just relaying what's in the violation notice. You have 30 days to file an appeal with the HOA board. The next meeting is scheduled for 3 weeks from now." After hanging up, I immediately called my supervisor at the Power Authority, David Chen. He'd been through the critical infrastructure designation process with me and understood the requirements better than anyone. "They can't prevent you from operating required equipment," David said firmly. "The state statute is clear. Critical infrastructure personnel must maintain operational capability at their primary residence. I'll have our legal department send you the relevant documentation." "Will that be enough for the HOA?" "It should be. If they push back, we can escalate." "The state takes these designations seriously, Wesley. Your ability to respond during emergencies isn't optional." That evening, I decided to approach Barbara directly before the situation escalated further. She lived 4 houses down in a meticulously maintained colonial with a yard that looked like it had been manicured with scissors. I'd barely pressed the doorbell when she opened it, as if she'd been watching me approach. Barbara was 53, with short blonde hair styled in that aggressive soccer mom cut that seemed to come standard with HOA board positions. She wore a cream-colored blouse and pressed khaki pants at 7 in the evening, like she might need to chair an emergency meeting at any moment. "Wesley," she said, not quite smiling, "I wondered when you'd come by. I got your letter. I wanted to explain about the generator." "There's nothing to explain. The noise ordinance in our covenants is quite clear. Non-emergency generator use is prohibited. Your generator has been running constantly." "Not constantly. Monthly required tests plus 3 actual emergencies in the past 6 months. I have logs." Barbara crossed her arms. "I have different logs. Last Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. The previous Thursday at 6 in the morning. 3 weeks ago on a Saturday evening. No power outages, Wesley. Your generator was just running. I'm required by state law to test the system monthly. I'm on the critical infrastructure list. When there's a major power event, I coordinate response from my home office." "Then you chose the wrong profession for living in an HOA community," Barbara said, her voice taking on that clipped tone I'd come to recognize. "We have rules here. Everyone follows them." I pulled out my phone and showed her the critical infrastructure designation letter from the State Power Authority. She glanced at it and shook her head. "That's between you and the state. It doesn't supersede our community covenants. You signed those covenants when you purchased your home. If your job requirements conflict with our rules, you'll need to either change jobs or relocate to a non-HOA neighborhood." The casual way she suggested I append my entire career and life made my jaw clench. "Barbara, I coordinate power restoration for 500,000 people. My equipment tests take 30 minutes per month. The emergency run times are genuine emergencies. $1,200 plus accumulating daily fines. The board meets in 3 weeks. You can plead your case then." She started to close the door. "I'll have documentation from the Power Authority. Bring whatever you'd like. Good evening, Wesley." The door clicked shut with a finality that told me this wasn't going to be resolved through reasonable conversation. I walked back to my house as the Arizona sun painted the sky orange and purple, already drafting the email to David Chen about needing that legal documentation sooner rather than later. Over the next week, I assembled my case like I was preparing for trial. The Power Authority's legal department sent a comprehensive packet explaining critical infrastructure designations, including the specific state statute that required designated personnel to maintain backup power and communications systems. I pulled my generator runtime logs, which showed exactly 28 minutes of testing each month on the 3rd Saturday, plus 3 emergency operations during confirmed grid events. I cross-referenced those emergency dates with public power outage records. On every date, Barbara had claimed was recreational generator use. There had been actual power grid issues, even if the outages hadn't affected our immediate neighborhood. During those events, I'd been on conference calls with the Power Authority, monitoring system status and coordinating repair crews. My neighbor to the left, an older retired engineer named Frank Martinez, stopped by while I was organizing documents on my patio table. "I heard Barbara got you about the generator," he said, settling into one of my deck chairs without invitation. Frank had lived in Meadowbrook Estates since the development was built 15 years ago. "She's been on a tear lately. Got the Johnsons about their mailbox being the wrong shade of black." Find the Patels because their daughter's car was parked on the street for 3 consecutive nights. It's a generator that runs for 30 minutes a month. Frank snorted. Doesn't matter. Barbara's got this idea that strict enforcement keeps property values high. She's not wrong exactly, but she takes it to extremes. Last year she tried to fine me because my oleander hedge was growing through the fence line by 2 inches. 2 inches, Wesley. What happened? I trimmed the damn hedge. Sometimes it's easier to just comply than fight. But your situation is different. You've got state law on your side. You think that'll matter to the board. Frank was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. The board is Barbara, mostly. The other 4 members just rubber stamp whatever she wants. There's technically a appeals process, but I've never seen anyone win. She's got the covenants memorized and she interprets them however suits her agenda. That sounds legally questionable. Probably is. But fighting it means lawyers and money. Most people just pay the fine or comply. I thought about that after Frank left. $1,200 was a lot of money, but it wasn't the fine that bothered me. It was the principle. I was following state law, performing required duties, and being penalized by someone who cared more about uniformity than common sense. The accumulating daily fines were the real problem. At $200 per day, I'd owe over $4,000 by the time of the board meeting. With the total climbing higher every day, I continued my required testing and emergency operations. The weekend before the board meeting, Phoenix experienced a major monsoon storm. The kind of violent weather event that makes national news and reminds people that Arizona isn't all dry desert heat. Lightning struck a major substation on the east side of the valley, causing cascading failures across multiple grid sectors. My phone started ringing at 6:45 in the morning, and I spent the next 14 hours coordinating response from my home office while my generator kept everything running. The power in Meadowbrook Estates flickered twice, but never fully dropped, thanks to our connection to a redundant grid sector. My generator ran continuously from 7 that morning until 9 that night, keeping my communications equipment, computers, and monitoring systems operational while I helped route repair crews to the hardest-hit areas. By the time the crisis was over and grid stability was restored, I'd helped coordinate the restoration of power to over 200,000 customers. I was exhausted, hungry, and proud of the work we'd done. Then I checked my doorbell camera footage and saw Barbara standing on my front porch at 3 in the afternoon, taking photos of my generator with her phone while my disaster response work continued inside. She'd sent an email to the entire HOA board by 5 that evening, which I received on copy as part of the violation documentation. In it, she described my flagrant disregard for the previous violation notice and detailed how my generator had run all day during weather that had barely affected our neighborhood. She recommended increasing the fine to $5,000 and pursuing legal action to force me to remove the generator entirely. I replied to the email, keeping my tone professional despite wanting to write something much more heated. I explained the nature of the power grid emergency, attached news articles about the substation failure and widespread outages, and included a statement from David Chen confirming my active duty status during the event. I CC'd the Power Authority's legal department on the email, figuring it couldn't hurt to have state officials aware of the situation. Barbara's response came within an hour. A single sentence. The board meeting is Wednesday at 7. Come prepared to explain why HOA rules shouldn't apply to you. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a building that mainly existed to house a gym that was never open and a pool that operated 3 months. a year. The board sat at a folding table at the front of the room like judges, with Barbara in the center, wearing a navy blazer that made the whole thing feel even more absurdly formal. The other board members were Larry Simmons, a middle-aged accountant who always looked nervous, Patricia Wu, a retired teacher who seemed uncomfortable with confrontation, Karen Miller, a stay-at-home mom who I'd never heard disagree with Barbara on anything, and Tom Reynolds, a sales manager who checked his phone constantly and rarely participated. About 15 neighbors had shown up to watch, which was apparently unusual. Frank gave me an encouraging nod from the back row. The Johnsons were there, probably hoping to see Barbara taken down a peg. I recognized a few other faces but didn't know most of them well. Barbara called the meeting to order with excessive formality, covering routine business about landscaping contracts and pool maintenance, before finally reaching violation appeals on the agenda. Wesley Owens has appealed the generator runtime violation, Barbara announced, looking directly at me in the front row. Wesley, you have 15 minutes to present your case. I stood and distributed copies of my documentation packet to each board member. Inside were the state statutes regarding critical infrastructure, my official designation letter, generator runtime logs, and confirmation from the Power Authority about the emergency operations during the monsoon. I'd also included a letter from David Chen explaining the importance of regular equipment testing. I'm a network operations supervisor for the Arizona Regional Power Grid, I began, keeping my voice steady and clear. 2 years ago, the State Power Authority designated my residence as critical infrastructure under Arizona Revised Statute 45-912. This designation legally requires me to maintain backup power systems capable of supporting emergency operations from my home office. I walked through the documentation, explaining each piece. The monthly tests took less than 30 minutes and were performed during afternoon hours to minimize disruption. The emergency operations were genuine responses to grid events, including the recent monsoon that had affected hundreds of thousands of customers. The state statute specifically preempts local regulations that would prevent critical infrastructure personnel from maintaining required equipment, I concluded. I'm not running a generator for fun. This is a legal requirement tied to my job coordinating emergency power restoration. Barbara had been making notes throughout my presentation, her expression unchanging. When I finished, she looked up with a thin smile. "Thank you, Wesley. Very thorough. However, you're misunderstanding the issue. We're not preventing you from having a generator. We're enforcing noise ordinances during non-emergency situations. Your testing can be performed during actual power outages, which occur several times per year. Your emergency operations during the monsoon were legitimate, and we're willing to waive fines for that specific day. But the regular testing and the other instances of operation during grid-stable periods are violations. Testing equipment during actual emergencies defeats the purpose of testing," I said, trying to keep frustration out of my voice. "If the generator fails to start during a real emergency, I can't perform my job. Monthly testing ensures operational readiness. Then test it more quietly, or during permitted hours. Our covenants allow generator operation from 10 in the morning to 8 at night during actual power outages only. Your monthly tests violate those hours." I pulled out another document, one the Power Authority's legal department had specifically prepared. Arizona Statute 45-912, Section 3. Paragraph B explicitly states that critical infrastructure personnel cannot be prevented by local ordinances or private covenants from conducting required equipment testing and emergency operations. The statute was created specifically to prevent situations like this. Barbara's expression finally shifted, showing the first signs of irritation. Mr. Owens, we're a private community. State statutes regarding infrastructure don't override private contracts, which is what our covenants represent. When you purchased your home, you agreed to these restrictions. State law does override private contracts when public safety is involved, I countered. My role in power grid emergency response is classified as essential public safety infrastructure. The statute is clear. Larry Simmons cleared his throat nervously. Barbara, maybe we should have our attorney review this before we proceed. If there's a state statute that preempts our covenants, we need to know. The covenants are clear, Barbara said firmly. We've consulted our attorney extensively about enforcement. Private property agreements are legally binding. Did you consult your attorney about this specific statute? I asked. Barbara's jaw tightened. We don't need to review every statute someone claims applies to them. The covenants are the governing document for this community. Patricia Wu raised her hand slightly, looking uncomfortable. I think Larry's right. If Wesley has a state designation for critical infrastructure, we should verify whether our covenants can actually enforce restrictions against it. I don't want the HOA to face legal liability. There's no legal liability, Barbara snapped. We're enforcing legitimate noise restrictions. Every homeowner in this community has the same rules. Every homeowner in this community isn't coordinating emergency power restoration for 500,000 people, I said, my patience finally wearing thin. I'm not running a leaf blower at dawn or having loud parties. I'm testing equipment that keeps the power grid functional. Barbara stood, her face flushed. The board will take this matter under advisement. We'll render a decision within 10 business days. This meeting is adjourned. Wait, Patricia said. Shouldn't we vote? I said we're taking it under advisement. Barbara gathered her papers and walked out of the room, leaving the other board members looking confused. Karen Miller quickly followed her. Tom Reynolds shrugged and left while checking his phone. Larry and Patricia remained, looking uncomfortable. I approached them after most of the neighbors had filed out. Is she always like this? Larry sighed. Barbara doesn't like being challenged. Look, Wesley, between us, I think you're probably right about the state statute. But Barbara controls the HOA finances, all the vendor relationships, and honestly, most of the decision-making. The rest of us are just there to provide the illusion of a democratic process. That doesn't sound legal either. Patricia nodded. It probably isn't. But fighting it means getting lawyers involved, having board elections, all sorts of drama. Most people just don't care enough about HOA politics to get involved. I care about being fined thousands of dollars for doing my job. Then you might need to get a lawyer, Larry said quietly. Because Barbara's not going to back down. She never does. I left the meeting feeling like I'd entered some bizarre alternate reality where common sense and state law were optional. Frank caught up with me in the parking lot. That was something, he said. Barbara looked ready to explode when you mentioned that statute. Think it'll matter, honestly? No. She'll find some way to interpret things in her favor. She always does. But you might have planted seeds of doubt with Larry and Patricia. If you push hard enough, there might be a crack in the board's unity. Over the next week, I focused on building a stronger case. The Power Authority's legal department connected me with a real estate attorney named James Wu, who had experience with HOA disputes. He reviewed my documentation and Barbara's violation notices. This is actually a pretty clear-cut case, James said during our consultation. The state statute explicitly preempts local restrictions on critical infrastructure operations. The HOA can't prevent you from operating required equipment, and they certainly can't fine you for it. The tricky part is that fighting an HOA can be expensive and time-consuming, even when you're legally right. How expensive? If they continue pushing the fines and force you to file suit, you're looking at $5,000 to $10,000 in legal fees, maybe more if it drags out. On the other hand, if they escalate to putting a lien on your property over unpaid fines, you'll need to fight it anyway. Can they actually put a lien on my house over this? They can try. Whether it would hold up in court is another question, but the process of clearing a lien is complicated and expensive. HOAs have a lot of power when it comes to enforcing their covenants, and many of them exploit that power. I hired James to send a formal legal response to the HOA, citing the relevant statutes and demanding they rescind the fines and violations. The letter was professional but firm, making it clear that continued harassment over my required generator operations would result in legal action. Barbara's response came in the form of another violation notice, this one for my unapproved legal representation in an internal HOA matter. Apparently, involving an attorney before exhausting all internal appeal processes was itself a violation of the covenants, subject to a $500 fine. "She's really something," James said when I forwarded him the new notice. "I've dealt with aggressive HOAs before, but this is next-level petty. However, she's actually helping our case. This kind of retaliatory violation is going to look terrible if this ends up in front of a judge." The board's official decision arrived exactly 10 business days after the meeting. They upheld the original fine, rejected my appeal, and ordered me to cease all generator operations except during power outages affecting my specific property. The decision made no mention of the state statute I'd cited and included a deadline of 30 days to pay the accumulated fines, which now totaled $6,800. James and I filed a lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court the next day, seeking an injunction against the HOA's enforcement actions and a declaratory judgment that state statute preempted their covenant restrictions. We also filed a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which had oversight of HOA management companies. Barbara's reaction was swift and escalating. Within a week, I received new violation notices for my mailbox being inadequately maintained, despite being identical to every other mailbox on my street. My garbage bins being visible from the street on a non-collection day because I'd forgotten to bring them in by noon, and my front yard grass being uneven in height, by what she claimed, was more than the allowed quarter-inch variance. Each violation came with additional fines. The harassment was obvious and documented, which James assured me was building our case, but it was also exhausting and stressful. Every morning I checked my front porch with a sense of dread, wondering what new nonsense Barbara would come up with. The turning point came during another monsoon storm, this one even more severe than the first. A series of lightning strikes caused multiple substation failures across the Phoenix metro area, creating a grid emergency that required all hands on deck. I spent nearly 18 hours straight coordinating response efforts, while my generator kept my systems running. Around hour 14, exhausted and surviving on coffee and adrenaline, I noticed movement on my doorbell camera. Barbara was in my front yard at 11 at night, in the middle of a thunderstorm, taking photos of my generator. She was wearing a rain jacket and had an umbrella, documenting my emergency operations with the dedication of an obsessed stalker. The video footage was surreal. Lightning flashing in the background, rain pouring down, and Barbara carefully photographing my generator from multiple angles while I worked inside to help restore power to hundreds of thousands of people. She stayed for nearly 20 minutes, taking dozens of photos, before finally leaving. I sent the footage to James immediately. His response came back within an hour despite the late time. "This is gold. She's demonstrating obsessive harassment during a documented emergency. Forward this to the power authority too. They need to see how their critical infrastructure personnel are being treated." David Chen's reaction was less measured. He called me at 7 the next morning, his voice tight with anger. "I've seen the footage. I've also been on the phone with the State Power Authority's General Counsel. This has gone beyond an HOA dispute, Wesley. Someone interfering with critical infrastructure operations during an emergency is potentially a criminal matter. The Attorney General's office is being notified." "I don't want to make this a criminal thing," I said, though part of me definitely wanted to see Barbara face real consequences. "I just want to do my job without being harassed and fined. This isn't about what you want anymore. The state takes critical infrastructure protection seriously. When designated personnel are prevented from performing their duties, especially during emergencies, that's a public safety issue. The Attorney General's office handles those cases." Things moved quickly after that. The Arizona Attorney General's office sent an investigator to interview me about the situation. I provided all my documentation, the violation notices, the video footage of Barbara photographing my equipment during the emergency, and the timeline of escalating harassment. The investigator, a serious woman named Detective Sarah Morrison, took extensive notes and asked detailed questions about my role in grid emergency response and how the HOA's actions had affected my ability to perform those duties. "Has the generator ever failed to operate due to lack of testing?" she asked. "No, because I've continued testing it despite the violations. But if I'd complied with the HOA's demands and stopped testing, equipment failure during an emergency would be likely. Generators require regular operation to maintain reliability. And during that 18-hour response period, when Mrs. Henderson was photographing your equipment, what were you coordinating?" I pulled up my logs from that night. "At that specific time, I was on a conference call with repair crews trying to restore power to a hospital in Scottsdale that was running on backup generators. We were prioritizing bringing their sector back online before their fuel reserves ran low." Detective Morrison's expression didn't change, but she made a long note. "So while you were working to restore power to a hospital, the HOA president was in your yard documenting your backup power system in the middle of a storm." "Yes, that's quite a visual." The Attorney General's investigation added a new dimension to the already complex situation. James filed an amended complaint in our civil case, adding claims of harassment and interference with critical infrastructure operations. The HOA, through their attorney, filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the dispute was a simple covenant enforcement matter. Then the local news got involved. A reporter from one of the Phoenix television stations had been monitoring court filings and saw the unusual case. She contacted me for an interview, and after consulting with James and David, I agreed. The interview aired during the evening news 2 days later. The reporter, Angela Chen, did an excellent job presenting the facts clearly. They showed my home, explained my role in power grid operations, and interviewed David Chen about the importance of critical infrastructure designations. Then, they showed Barbara's violation notices and the video footage of her photographing my generator during the emergency. The story framed it exactly as it was. An overzealous HOA president harassing a power grid worker for operating equipment required by state law to protect public safety. The segment ended with Angela asking Barbara for comment. Barbara had refused to be interviewed on camera, but had sent a written statement defending the HOA's right to enforce its covenants. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The news station's social media pages filled with comments supporting me and criticizing the HOA. Several other homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates came forward with their own stories of Barbara's aggressive enforcement tactics. The story got picked up by national news outlets, who loved the angle of an HOA interfering with power grid operations. I received dozens of messages from neighbors I'd barely spoken to, expressing support and sharing their own grievances with Barbara's leadership. Frank stopped by with a petition signed by 43 homeowners calling for Barbara's removal from the board. "She's been pissing people off for years," Frank explained, "but everyone was too afraid or apathetic to do anything about it. Your situation finally gave people a reason to organize. We're demanding a special election for the board." The media attention and community organizing seemed to be having an effect. Patricia Wu resigned from the board with a public statement saying she couldn't support the HOA's actions against me and disagreed with Barbara's leadership style. Larry Simmons stopped responding to Barbara's emails and started attending the community organizing meetings, but Barbara doubled down. She sent a letter to every homeowner in Meadowbrook Estates, defending her actions and arguing that allowing me to violate the covenants would set a precedent that would destroy property values. She claimed I was using my job as an excuse to operate noisy equipment whenever I wanted, and that the media coverage was misrepresenting the facts. The letter was a masterpiece of missing the point. She never addressed the state statute, never acknowledged the legitimate nature of my equipment testing, and never showed any understanding of why critical infrastructure designations existed. It was all about rules and property values and her authority as HOA president. A few homeowners sided with her, mostly people who hadn't followed the situation closely and took Barbara's letter at face value. But the majority sentiment was clearly turning against her, especially after the Attorney General's office served her with a formal notice of investigation. The investigation notice was a public record, and the news stations covered it eagerly. The Attorney General was investigating whether Barbara's actions constituted interference with critical infrastructure operations, a misdemeanor under Arizona law, and whether her harassment during the emergency response period rose to the level of criminal obstruction. I honestly wasn't sure how I felt about the criminal investigation. Part of me just wanted the whole thing to be over. I wanted to do my job, test my equipment, and live in my house without constantly worrying about violation notices and fines. But another part of me recognized that Barbara had genuinely interfered with emergency operations, had prioritized HOA rules over public safety, and needed to face real consequences. The civil case moved forward while the criminal investigation continued. The judge assigned to our case, Judge Thomas Martinez, scheduled a hearing on our motion for a preliminary injunction. We were asking the court to immediately prevent the HOA from enforcing the generator violations while the case proceeded. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in late October. The courthouse air conditioning was running cold despite the mild Phoenix weather, and I sat at the plaintiff's table with James while the HOA's attorney, a stern-looking man named Richard Palmer, set up his materials across the aisle. Barbara sat in the gallery behind Palmer, her expression rigid. Karen Miller was with her, but the rest of the board was notably absent. Several of my neighbors had come to watch, including Frank and the Johnsons. A couple of reporters sat in the back row. Judge Martinez was in his 60s, with gray hair and the weary expression of someone who had presided over too many disputes between people who should have been able to work things out themselves. "This is a homeowners association dispute that appears to have escalated considerably," he said after calling the case. "Mr. Wu, explain why your client needs emergency injunctive relief." James stood and presented our case clearly and concisely. He explained my critical infrastructure designation, the state statute that required me to maintain operational readiness, and the HOA's pattern of fining and harassing me for complying with state law. He showed the video footage of Barbara photographing my equipment during the emergency response period. "Your Honor, the HOA has accumulated over $6,800 in fines against Mr. Owens for operating state-required equipment. They've threatened to place a lien on his property if he doesn't pay. Meanwhile, Mr. Owens faces potential state sanctions if he fails to maintain his equipment according to the critical infrastructure designation requirements. He's caught between contradictory legal obligations, but state statute clearly preempts the HOA covenants in this situation." Palmer stood to respond, arguing that the HOA had legitimate authority to enforce noise ordinances and that my situation didn't warrant special treatment. "Mr. Owens chose to purchase a home in an HOA community," Palmer argued. "He signed the covenants. If his job requirements conflict with those covenants, the appropriate solution is to relocate to a more suitable property, not to demand exemption from rules that apply to everyone else." Judge Martinez interrupted. "Counsel, is there a state statute that requires Mr. Owens to maintain backup power systems at his residence?" Palmer hesitated. "There's a critical infrastructure program, yes, but that doesn't automatically override private property agreements." "Actually, it does," Judge Martinez said, flipping through the statute we'd submitted. Arizona Revised Statute 45-912, Section 3, Paragraph B says, and I'm reading here, "Local ordinances, regulations, and private covenants shall not prevent critical infrastructure personnel from conducting required equipment testing and emergency operations at their designated residence." That seems pretty clear to me, Counselor. "Your Honor, the HOA's position is that Mr. Owens can test his equipment during actual power outages, which would satisfy both the state requirement and the covenant restrictions." "That's nonsense," Judge Martinez said bluntly. "You test emergency equipment before emergencies, not during them. That's the entire point of testing. Mr. Palmer, I'm inclined to grant the preliminary injunction. Does your client have any compelling argument why I shouldn't?" Palmer conferred briefly with Barbara, who was whispering urgently to him. He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the HOA is concerned about setting a precedent where homeowners can claim exemptions from covenants based on employment requirements. What if someone claims their job requires them to operate a commercial vehicle from their residence, or store hazardous materials, or conduct activities that disturb the community? Those situations would be evaluated on their own merits," Judge Martinez said. "This situation involves a state statute specifically designed to preempt local restrictions on critical infrastructure operations. It's not a blanket exemption from all covenants. It's a specific legal protection for a specific purpose. The preliminary injunction is granted. The HOA is enjoined from enforcing the generator violations, collecting the associated fines, or taking any action against Mr. Owens related to his required equipment testing and emergency operations. The case will proceed to trial, but in the meantime, Mr. Owens can perform his duties without harassment. Barbara stood up in the gallery. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The HOA has a right to enforce its covenants. We can't just ignore violations because someone has a state job. Judge Martinez looked at her over his glasses. Madam, I've just issued a court order. If you disagree with it, you can file an appeal. But if you continue to violate this injunction by harassing Mr. Owens, you'll be held in contempt of court. Is that clear? Barbara's face flushed red, but she sat down without responding. Karen Miller grabbed her arm, probably preventing her from saying something that would land her in immediate trouble. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders for the first time in months. The injunction meant I could do my job without constantly looking over my shoulder for violation notices. The fines were frozen. Barbara couldn't touch me, at least not legally. James was pleased but cautious. The injunction is great, but the case still needs to go to trial. And there's still the criminal investigation. Don't be surprised if Barbara finds other ways to make your life difficult. People like her don't back down easily. He was right. 3 days after the hearing, I received a violation notice for my front door wreath being non-compliant seasonal decoration. I'd hung an autumn wreath in early November, and Barbara claimed it violated the covenant provision limiting seasonal decorations to a 2-week period before and after the relevant holiday. Since Thanksgiving was 3 weeks away, my wreath was apparently illegal. I forwarded the notice to James, who sent a letter reminding the HOA about the court's injunction and warning that continued harassment could result in contempt charges. The violation was withdrawn, but the message was clear. Barbara wasn't done fighting. The special election that Frank and the other homeowners were organizing gained momentum. They gathered enough signatures to force a recall vote on Barbara's board position, as well as elections for the seats vacated by Patricia and potentially other board members who might resign. The election was scheduled for early December. Barbara campaigned aggressively, sending multiple letters to homeowners arguing that the recall was orchestrated by complainers who don't want to follow the rules, and warning that removing her would lead to deteriorating property values and community decay. She organized a meeting at the clubhouse for her supporters, but only about 15 people showed up. The community meeting organized by the recall proponents drew over 100 homeowners. I attended and was surprised by how many people wanted to share their stories of Barbara's enforcement tactics. She'd fine people for having basketball hoops in their driveways, for garden gnomes that violated the aesthetic consistency provisions, for cars parked in garages with doors accidentally left open, for trash bins visible through open garage doors, for Christmas lights left up 3 days into January, for not watering lawns during the peak of summer despite water conservation recommendations, and dozens of other petty infractions. One woman, Teresa Johnson, stood up and described how Barbara had fined her $500 because her 10-year-old daughter had drawn a hopscotch grid on their driveway with washable chalk. Apparently, sidewalk chalk constituted unauthorized markings on exterior surfaces. Another homeowner, Robert Kim, explained that Barbara had threatened to fine him when his lawn died during a water main break because brown grass violates community standards, even though he had no water to keep it alive. The stories kept coming, painting a picture of an HOA president who had lost sight of the community's actual interests in favor of rigid rule enforcement. The recall suddenly seemed inevitable. The criminal investigation reached its conclusion in late November. Detective Morrison interviewed Barbara extensively, reviewed all the documentation, and consulted with the Attorney General's office about potential charges. The conclusion was that, while Barbara's actions were inappropriate and potentially subject to civil liability, they didn't quite rise to the level of criminal obstruction. However, the investigation report was scathing, describing her behavior as obsessive, harassing, and demonstrating a concerning disregard for public safety considerations. The report noted that while she hadn't prevented me from operating my equipment, her aggressive enforcement campaign during emergency operations showed poor judgment and misplaced priorities. The report was public record, and the news stations covered it. It wasn't the criminal charges some people were hoping for, but it was official confirmation from state investigators that Barbara had been in the wrong. The recall election took place on a Saturday in early December. The community had rented the clubhouse for the day, and homeowners could vote in person or by proxy. The turnout was remarkable, with over 70% participation compared to the usual 15 to 20% for routine HOA elections. I voted early in the morning and then tried to distract myself with yard work and errands. Frank called me around 4 in the afternoon. The counting is done. Barbara lost by a landslide. 68% voted to remove her. The new board members are all people who supported your case. It's over, Wesley. You won. I didn't feel the triumphant surge of victory I'd expected. Mostly, I felt relieved and exhausted. The months of stress and harassment had taken their toll, and even with Barbara removed from power, I'd never feel quite as comfortable in Meadowbrook Estates as I had before this all started. The new HOA board held its first meeting a week later. The new president was Maria Santos, a software engineer who had been one of the first people to sign Frank's recall petition. She invited me to attend as they discussed their first order of business. "We're rescinding all of Wesley Owens' violations and fines," Maria announced to the small group of homeowners present. "We're also formally apologizing for the previous board's actions and implementing new policies to prevent similar situations. The covenants need to be updated to explicitly acknowledge state and federal law preemptions, and we're creating an appeals process that isn't just rubber stamping the president's decisions." The board voted unanimously. Just like that, $6,800 in fines vanished, and I had official permission to operate my legally required equipment. James and I met to discuss our civil lawsuit. With Barbara removed from the board and the new board rescinding the violations, we had essentially won everything we were asking for. We could still proceed to trial and seek damages for the harassment and stress, James said. "You'd probably win. But it would take time and money, and you'd be suing your own HOA, which means you'd be suing yourself and your neighbors to some degree." I thought about it. The legal fees had already cost me several $1,000s. Pursuing additional damages would mean more time in court, more stress, more conflict with neighbors who were mostly innocent bystanders to Barbara's campaign. "Let's settle," I said. "If they'll agree to pay my legal fees and make the covenant changes permanent, I'll drop the lawsuit." The settlement was reached within 2 weeks. The HOA paid my attorney fees, formally amended the covenants to acknowledge critical infrastructure preemptions, and issued a written apology. In return, I dismissed the lawsuit with prejudice, meaning I couldn't refile it later. Barbara disappeared from community events. I saw her occasionally, driving past in her car or checking her mail, but she didn't make eye contact and never spoke to me. Karen Miller, her closest ally on the old board, moved away in January. The other former board members stayed in the community but kept low profiles. Life gradually returned to normal. I continued my work coordinating power grid operations, testing my generator monthly without harassment, and responding to emergencies when needed. The new HOA board was professional and reasonable, handling community business without the authoritarian tendencies that had defined Barbara's leadership. In February, Arizona experienced one of the worst winter storms in decades. A massive cold front brought freezing temperatures and ice storms across the Phoenix metro area, causing widespread power outages. The grid was strained beyond capacity as everyone cranked up electric heating systems simultaneously, and several major transmission lines failed due to ice accumulation. I spent 3 days essentially living in my home office, coordinating emergency response while my generator kept everything running. The power in Meadowbrook Estates was out for 36 hours, and several neighbors came by to thank me for the work I was doing to get their power restored. Frank stopped by on day 2 with a thermos of hot coffee and a sandwich. "Your generator's been running constantly. I don't think anyone's complained." The new board sent an email thanking critical infrastructure personnel for their service during the emergency. Times have changed. Frank looked at the generator humming in my side yard. "You know, I never realized how important this stuff was. When Barbara was fining you, I thought it was just another HOA overreach story. But watching you work these past few days, seeing how much coordination goes into keeping the power on, I get it now. That generator isn't a convenience. It's critical equipment for critical work." That's all I wanted people to understand. The storm eventually passed, and the power was restored. Life continued. I worked my shifts coordinating grid operations, maintained my equipment, and lived peacefully in my home without fear of violation notices. 6 months after the recall, Maria Santos stopped by to let me know that the HOA had been contacted by the State Power Authority. They were recommending Meadowbrook Estates as a model community for how HOAs should accommodate critical infrastructure designations. Our covenant amendments were being shared with other HOAs across Arizona as a template. "Your case changed things," Maria said. "Not just here, but statewide." Other power grid workers were having similar problems with their HOAs. The Power Authority created a whole program now to educate HOA boards about critical infrastructure requirements. They're using your situation as the case study for why this matters. I hadn't expected that. The fight with Barbara had felt so personal, so focused on my specific situation, that I hadn't thought about broader implications. But the reality was that critical infrastructure personnel across the state had been quietly dealing with similar issues, and my case had forced the system to change. In late spring, I received a letter from the Arizona Power Authority. It was a formal commendation for my service during the winter storm emergency, specifically noting my coordination of repair efforts that had restored power to over 300,000 customers. The letter mentioned the challenges I'd faced with my HOA and thanked me for persevering in maintaining my operational readiness despite those obstacles. David Chen called me after the commendation was issued. "You handled this whole situation with remarkable professionalism, Wesley. A lot of people would have just moved or quit. You stood your ground and forced the system to work correctly. That matters. I just wanted to do my job. That's exactly why it matters. You weren't trying to be a crusader or make a statement. You were just trying to do the work. When bureaucracy and petty tyranny got in the way, you pushed back. That's what public service looks like sometimes." I framed the commendation and hung it in my home office, next to my critical infrastructure designation certificate. Every time I run my monthly generator test, which I still do on the 3rd Saturday of each month, I think about how close I came to giving in to Barbara's demands just to make the harassment stop. The HOA experience taught me something important about community dynamics and petty authority. There are always going to be Barbara Hendersons in the world, people who find purpose and identity in rigid rule enforcement and who prioritize order over reason. Most of the time, they operate unchecked because fighting them is exhausting and expensive, and most people would rather just comply than engage in prolonged conflict. But sometimes the fight matters. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting yourself, but about protecting the principle that rules should serve the community's actual interests, not just the preferences of whoever happens to be in charge. Meadowbrook Estates is a better community now. The HOA still enforces reasonable standards for property maintenance and aesthetic consistency, but with flexibility and common sense. When conflicts arise, the board looks for solutions instead of wielding the covenants like a weapon. Property values have actually increased since the leadership change, probably because people enjoy living in a community that treats homeowners like adults rather than subjects. I still see Barbara occasionally. She keeps her head down and her yard immaculate, probably afraid that any violation would be met with the same zealous enforcement she once practiced. I don't take any pleasure in that. I'd rather live in a community where everyone feels comfortable and secure, even former adversaries. My generator sits in my side yard, maintained and ready. I test it monthly, run it during emergencies, and never give it a second thought. The equipment that once caused months of stress and conflict is just another part of my home infrastructure now, quietly ensuring I can do my job when the community needs me. On warm Phoenix evenings, I sometimes sit on my back patio and think about how strange the whole situation was. How something as mundane as a backup generator became the focal point of a legal battle that involved state investigators, court orders, community organizing, and news coverage. How one person's obsession with rules and authority created a crisis that didn't need to exist. But I also think about the neighbors who came together to demand better leadership, the board members who resigned rather than support injustice, the attorney and investigators who took the situation seriously, and the judge who cut through the nonsense to enforce the law correctly. The system worked eventually because enough people decided it should. My career with the Power Authority continues. I coordinate grid operations, respond to emergencies, and help keep the lights on across Arizona. The critical infrastructure designation that caused so much trouble is now just a footnote in my personnel file, acknowledged and accommodated rather than controversial. Last month, I got a call from another Power Authority employee dealing with HOA problems similar to what I'd faced. His HOA was trying to prevent him from maintaining required communications equipment, claiming the antennas violated their aesthetic standards. I spent an hour on the phone with him, sharing my documentation and legal strategy, connecting him with James Wu, and encouraging him to stand firm. The fight we had in Meadowbrook Estates created a roadmap for others facing similar situations. The covenant amendments we negotiated became a template. The legal precedents we established made future cases easier. The story that felt so personal and frustrating while I was living through, it became a resource for others dealing with the same bureaucratic tyranny. That's ultimately what made the whole ordeal worthwhile. Not the vindication or the legal victory, but knowing that standing up to petty authority when it conflicts with genuine public needs can create change that helps others. Barbara Henderson wanted to enforce rules for their own sake, to maintain control and order according to her personal vision. But her overreach ended up strengthening protections for critical infrastructure personnel across the state and educating HOA boards about the limits of their authority. Sometimes the right to do your job, to serve your community, to fulfill your responsibilities, requires fighting for that right. Sometimes backing down would be easier, but would also enable systems that shouldn't be enabled. Sometimes a generator is just a generator, but sometimes it's a symbol of whether rules serve people or people serve rules. I run my monthly test on schedule, maintain my equipment meticulously, and respond to emergencies whenever they arise. The work continues, the equipment runs, and the community it serves rarely thinks about the infrastructure that keeps their power flowing and their lives running normally. That's exactly how it should be. Critical infrastructure works best when it's invisible, reliable, and protected from interference by people who prioritize appearances over function. My generator hums quietly in my side yard once a month, a sound that once generated violation notices and legal battles, but now just represents preparation and readiness. The house is quiet tonight. Phoenix temperatures have cooled to comfortable levels. My generator sits ready but dormant. Inside my home office, the monitoring equipment stays connected to the power grid's coordination systems, ready to support emergency operations if needed. Everything is exactly as it should be, protected by law, supported by my community, and enabling me to serve the broader public need. Barbara Henderson taught me that unreasonable authority eventually defeats itself when confronted with people willing to stand up for legitimate rights. The HOA system she weaponized ended up reformed because she pushed too far against someone who had both the legal standing and the determination to push back. Her legacy in Meadowbrook Estates isn't the rigid order she tried to enforce, but the more balanced and reasonable governance that replaced her leadership. I don't regret buying a home in an HOA community. I don't even regret the conflict, though I wouldn't want to repeat it. The experience taught me valuable lessons about bureaucratic overreach, community organizing, legal systems, and the importance of standing firm when you're genuinely right. It connected me with neighbors I might never have known otherwise, and gave me insights into how local governance actually functions. The generator that started everything continues its quiet service, tested monthly, ready for emergencies, legally protected and community approved. It's just equipment serving its purpose, which is all it ever was and all I ever wanted it to be. The drama and conflict that surrounded it for those difficult months now seems almost surreal, a strange chapter in an otherwise straightforward career serving the public infrastructure needs. Tonight the grid is stable, the power is flowing, and Meadowbrook Estates is peaceful. My generator sits ready, my equipment stays maintained, and the systems that keep modern life functioning continue their invisible work. That's the victory, not the legal battles or the recall election, but the simple ability to do necessary work without harassment or interference. The HOA that once tried to fine me thousands of dollars for operating critical equipment now acknowledges the importance of that work in their governing documents. The community that watched the conflict unfold now understands why some rules need to bend to accommodate larger public needs. The system that nearly broke under the weight of one person's authoritarian tendencies reformed itself and became stronger. My home office light stays on, powered by the grid I help protect, backed up by the generator I fought to maintain. The work continues, the community thrives, and the lessons learned from conflict between petty authority and legitimate necessity remain relevant for anyone else who might face similar situations. This is how critical infrastructure actually works in residential communities. Sometimes it requires legal battles and community organizing. Sometimes it faces resistance from people who don't understand or don't care about the larger public need. But ultimately, when the systems work correctly, public safety and community service win out over rigid bureaucracy and personal authority. The generator runs its monthly test. The HOA acknowledges its necessity. The community benefits from the work it enables. And I continue serving, supporting the infrastructure that millions of people depend on without thinking about it, which is exactly how infrastructure should function. That's the real ending to the story. Not dramatic confrontation or legal victory, but the quiet continuation of necessary work, protected by law, supported by community, and serving the public need. Everything else was just the process of getting back to this baseline of functional service, temporarily disrupted by someone who confused rule enforcement with leadership and control with community service. The disruption has passed. The work continues. The generator runs when needed. And Meadowbrook Estates has learned the difference between rules that serve the community and rules that serve themselves.